everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 98 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to have back John Champion, one half of MissionLogPodcast.com, who, along with his partner Ken Ray, have a podcast which discusses all things Star Trek. In this episode, I visit with John about the movies with the original crew, the animated series, and some of his wrap-up thoughts on his first 100 episodes. Thank you. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and welcome to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today it is my distinct pleasure, after several technical snafus on my part, to bring back one of the podcasters I enjoy the most, which is John Champion. John is one half of a human-robot combination, robot named Ken Ray, who do MissionLog.com podcast. Mission Log is a podcast of all things Star Trek episode and movie wise. That includes the original series, the animated series, the movies, and we are now on the next generation, TNG. And for the next, I think, 12 years, John and his robot friend Ken have a gig every week with the rest of the Star Trek world of TV shows and movies. So with all of that, welcome back, John. I'm thrilled to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I will try my best to be both compliant and ethical on your show. I really appreciate it. Yeah, and you're right. We've got, it's 2014 as of this show, and we assume we'll be going until about 2026. And maybe there's more Star Trek to come after that. We don't know.
We can only hope so.
Yeah.
The reason I contacted John about this show was he, as I said, he and Ken have gone through the original series, the animated series, the first 6 movies starring the original crew, and are now in TNG. I've managed to catch up, coming into the program a little bit late, and I thought it might be a good time for some reflection. So I've asked John some questions about some of the things that I heard and listened to over the past, now I think, episode 110 today.
I think that's right. Yeah. I think we're about at 110 or 112, something like that. Yeah.
So, John, the first thing I'd like to ask you is you and Ken both prepare extensively for your show, but you, for the most part, appear to prepare individually, sharing notes really only at the last minute before you record. Could you explain the preparation you go through for each episode?
Yeah, we knew from the very beginning that we had to keep things spontaneous and conversational. So we decided right from the start that we would create a shared document. We use Google Docs, and I'll usually create that. I'll build kind of the structure of the show. We know that there will be an intro and a story recap and trivia. But we don't actually fill in our notes until just a minute before we record. So I'll usually work, the way I do it, I'll watch an episode through just on its own, really without taking too many notes, just kind of formulating some ideas in my head. Then I go back and watch again, pausing to write down my initial impressions. If it's a week that I'm writing the story recap, then I'll go back through kind of toward the end of the process and jot down my scene-by-scene description. And then I get to go back and do it all again in order to fill in the trivia. And the trivia begins with, online, or if it's a Blu-ray or a DVD special feature that I'm looking at, or an interview that I'm reviewing. And then I try to corroborate the information that I get from that with any documents or any other published materials that we have about a show. So I got a stack of books next to my computer here, everything from Inside Star Trek and the biography of Gene Roddenberry and biographies just about all the cast members. I use that. I use what we have in the archive at the Roddenberry office, very often script notes, memos, just anything to sort of fill in the gaps. And then at the very last minute, like I said, before we record, we go back through, we copy and paste our notes into that shared document. We'll maybe give it a quick glance just so I kind of know where Ken's coming from, he knows where I'm coming from. But the discussion itself is, what you hear is what you get.
In terms of the videos you view, do you view the new high def videos? Do you view them as they originally were presented in the series? Do you use a combination? How does that work?
All of the above. So the good news is that you can get Star Trek anywhere at any time. And I've got the Blu-rays, I've got the DVDs, I've got a Netflix account, I've got a Hulu account. You can download the stuff on iTunes. You can go to StarTrek.com, the official website, and stream videos there. And it kind of depends on where you go for what you get. If you watch Next Generation on Netflix, it's standard def. If you watch it on Hulu, it's the new high def remasters. And I have to say, the high def remasters of Next Gen, that's definitely my preferred way of viewing the show. I remember watching the show in the 80s when it premiered, looked fine, but then over the years, you give it 20, 25 years, and it starts to look a little dated. And those original standard def broadcast tapes, when you catch them now, the colors are just smeared and murky. There's very little detail. What they've done with the high def Blu-ray release is remarkable. It really makes that show alive again in a way that it was not for a number of years.
I have not purchased the high def Next Generation series, but I have for the original series. And I was like you, I was just blown away by what they were able to do with remastering. Is it that sort of level? Did you feel that level of excitement?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a little bit different process for people who are geeky and into it like I am. The original series Blu-rays, so they had the original film elements, but you couldn't actually go back and remaster the special effects. You had to recreate the special effects. So they built those up from CG, and they took some artistic license where it was appropriate to give us some new angles of the Enterprise that we never saw before. And people argued it then, and they will continue to argue it now. It's been about 10 years since those were released, maybe not quite 10 years. Now, with Next Gen, it's a little bit different because they have the original effects elements. So what they do is they go back and they rebuild the special effects from the original elements, and they only tweak those where, say it's a shot of a planet, and the original image that they have of the planet, the matte painting, is maybe just not detailed enough, not realistic enough. So they'll go back in and do a CG model on top of that. But the model work, all that stuff is original, and it's just been brought back together using modern technology. So a little bit less in the way of artistic license when it comes to Next Gen. But they both look amazing. And everybody I've ever talked to said, and I agree, look, if all you're paying attention to is the special effects, you're missing the point. You're missing the story.
Well, I think I may have just found the Christmas present I want from my wife.
Yeah, there you go. Good call. Good call.
If I can turn to the movies with the original crew now. There's a couple of themes that I saw or wanted to maybe ask you about that I saw throughout the movies, and certainly you and Ken's commentary. And the first one was the change or growth in Mr. Spock. In Star Trek One, the movie version, the movie, he is on the planet of Vulcan in a discipline to rid himself of all emotions and move into a purely logical state. He's recalled, comes back to the Enterprise for his own reasons because he senses a presence. Yet, at the end of the original, of the movie, he makes one of the most dramatic gestures for me in any Star Trek movie, which is he says, V'ger can't experience this, and if you can't see me doing this on the video, it's holding out my hand to shake the hand of John Champion virtually.
Right.
But V'ger can't do that, and Spock realized for me, it was Spock realizing it's the human contact. It's the being with other beings, whether they be Vulcan, human, Terran, or whatever race. And he, throughout the rest of the 6 episodes of the movies, he moves to a more complete human being, perhaps less Vulcan. Was that one of your takes?
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think an interesting thing happened with Spock, that with the original series, you have Captain Kirk, who is very much the hero. And in the 1960s, TV shows were not ensemble shows the way they are now. You know, you had casts, and you had casts where you might have been pulling for, you know, any one of a number of characters, but you definitely had a hero. And William Shatner as Captain Kirk was the star of that show. But then an interesting thing happened. Spock started being a favorite, and Leonard Nimoy started getting a ton of mail, of fan mail. And by the time you fast forward 10 years and they're making a movie, you kind of realize that Spock is the heart of the show, because what Star Trek, if Star Trek is an exploration of humanity and what makes human beings tick, well, the best way to do that is to put somebody who is non-human up as a reflection for you to see yourself in. And Spock's journey, trying to learn what it means to be human, wrestling with his half-human side and determining who he's going to be, that's sort of the journey that all of us get to take through this series. So I think it was very smart that in Star Trek the Motion Picture, that is the moment where the Spock character changes. And really, his journey then becomes a major part of the focus for the remaining original cast movies. That scene that you describe is such a favorite for me. There are a couple of great Spock moments in that movie. When he sheds a tear for V'ger, that's very, very powerful. But at the beginning of that movie, he blocks the Vulcan priestess from giving him the symbol of having passed Kolinar, the ultimate Vulcan sort of mystical journey of eschewing all emotion to become purely logical. And we know that Vulcans have emotions, they just repress them as best they can. But in Star Trek the Motion Picture, he really truly embraces that side of himself, because he sees that half-human, that emotional side of himself is what makes him whole, and it's what makes him able to communicate and contact and have fulfillment with his friends and crewmates.
A second question I wanted to pose is really the journey of the Enterprise crew throughout the first 6 movies. And I saw that as what do you do? How do you grow old? How do you grow old in space? But more importantly, how do you grow old and how do you age if in your 30s you have captained a star cruiser, the Starship Enterprise, and then within the context of the work environment they're in, the United Federation of Planets and Starfleet, what's the role of an aging commander? Is it to be out running around the stars? Is it to train, I hate to use this pun, but the next generation? And we saw the crew struggle with that. We saw them age, frankly, 25 years from the original series in the mid-60s up until the late 80s, and we saw that on screen, and we saw them change. So what were some of your thoughts about whether they were able to age, or how that even spoke to us?
You know, it's interesting. That whole idea is very relative. I was having a conversation the other day with a friend of mine about James Bond, and we were figuring out the relative ages of the actors when they played Bond. And we were both saying, okay, if you take Roger Moore, he played Bond the oldest. So by the end of his run, I think he was 60, or he was nearly 60. He was about 58. But if you look at his best movie, arguably, in my opinion, his best movie was The Spy Who Loved Me. He was 52 when he made that movie. And then I looked up, and I think William Shatner was 52 when he played Kirk in The Wrath of Khan, or it was very close. It was somewhere in his early 50s. And we were just both thinking, wow, you know, how different the perspective is that version of Roger Moore's Bond, he was still the man. He was still in charge. He was still an action hero. But you take William Shatner, and now we're making a big deal out of his being older and not fitting into the world that we grew up watching him be a part of. So I don't know if that would be a different take on it now. It might be, because an actor who's 50, 51, 52, we may not look at as necessarily being old. But all that said, I think they did a very smart thing by Nicholas Meyer coming in and writing the story that he wrote for The Wrath of Khan, and addressing something that was apparent to the audience, which is these actors don't look like the actors that I saw on TV in 1966. They look different. They look older. And how do we address that? How do we address storylines that are taking 15 to 20 years to play out? There has to be a real world human toll that takes on somebody. And I don't know that Star Trek necessarily has a definitive answer on how you're supposed to behave. I don't think we come to a final conclusion about what Kirk is supposed to do or who he is supposed to be. But I do think that Star Trek at least makes a case of saying you have to accept it, and you have to, at the very least, acknowledge the reality of maybe the consequences of the actions that you have done. He certainly has to face it with Khan. And he is then presented with a new challenge with a girlfriend he hasn't seen in 20 years and a son that he knew about, but certainly was pushed out of his life. So Kirk is faced with the idea of at least having to deal with and integrate into his life the consequences of his actions.
If I could turn now to the animated series. This came out in the early 70s. Not everyone has seen the animated series, but what I wanted to ask you was, it came up in many ways, or many of the scripts that were used in the animated series had been submitted as at least story ideas for the original series. And I wondered, and what I got from the animated series in many ways, it filled out the body of work, sort of the background of Star Trek. Could you speak to, I don't think many of my listeners would understand the creative process that goes into any TV show, whether that be a production show like the original series or even an animated series. You have a story idea, then you have a pitch, then you have an editor, then you have a screenwriter, you have an associate producer, assistant producer, producer, and a director. How does all of that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a miracle that anything gets made at all, because everybody is answering to a multitude of bosses and taking in a multitude of opinions. And that original story, that kernel of that story idea may have absolutely no resemblance to the final product at all. And you can read about in Star Trek's history the many times that writers have felt maybe slighted. And that's not just Star Trek. That's TV in general, that people feel slighted by. Well, I sold this story, and then what they aired was nothing like what I sold, so I'm taking my name off of it, whatever the case may be. The animated series was an interesting anomaly, because here Star Trek had been off the air for 4 years when the animated series came back, and they treated it like they were doing more Star Trek. They treated it exactly like they were picking up from the original series. The only difference was, instead of going down to Paramount Stage 19 and building a set and turning on a camera, they were doing it all on animation cells, and they were using the Filmation guys, Lou Scheimer's company. They were using Filmation to draw out these adventures on screen, which gives you a lot of freedom. Then you can imagine anything, because they could draw whatever you imagine. But Gene Roddenberry very wisely said, okay, I want a certain amount of creative control here. I'm going to bring in the people that I worked with on the original series. So DC Fontana, who was story editor on the original series. They brought in writers that they had worked with before. They continued plot lines that they had started in the original series and did sequels or at least references to those original events. So the way they looked at it, that might have been as good as it ever got. That, hey, look, we had this show that ran for 3 years. We were proud of it. It got canceled. Here's our last gasp to be able to tell more of those stories. So let's do it. And they had no idea that in a few years, there would be a movie and another TV series and another TV series and all these other things that Star Trek spawned. So my hat is definitely off to them for doing the best they could possibly do, given certain limits of animation and how that process works.
Now I'd like to turn to one of your supplemental episodes. And the supplemental episodes are completely enjoyable. They're a ton of fun. You talk to people like writers. You've talked to people who were actors. Just a wide variety of people associated with Star Trek throughout the years. And one of them was David Gerrold. And David was the writer for The Trouble with Tribbles. I was really looking forward to that episode. Saved it till the end. And I listened to it. And he, frankly, had some criticisms or comments of Gene Roddenberry that were not complimentary and I had not heard before. And when I heard them, it seemed as if almost the air got sucked out of the podcast. And you and Ken, I was wondering how you and Ken would respond because, of course, you work for Rod Roddenberry. It's a podcast about Star Trek. And your response, or at least my interpretation of your response, was that you allowed him to say his piece. You didn't comment on it. You didn't make a judgment. You allowed me as the listener to make my own judgment. And what I wanted to ask you is, as a podcaster, I sometimes get those moments, and I wanted to see, how do you view your job as the host of a podcast when something like that occurs?
Yeah, that's kind of a tough question because I could start out by saying, well, what we try to do is be journalistic and we want to have a respectful conversation and let the guest take center stage. We want them to tell their story, and we're just there to kind of help move the story along and not really make judgment calls. Now, if you listen to our supplemental with Roberto Orci, who co-wrote Star Trek, the 2009 movie, and Star Trek Into Darkness, I let him have it at a certain point. But I felt comfortable enough to do that because Bob is a great guy and he's very kind and he's very thoughtful about his work, and he can take it to an extent, and he was there and he was willing to let us do that. And it's important to know that whenever we do an interview, there are a couple of things that we always say. We always preface it by saying, look, we're fans of Star Trek and we're fans of your work, to whomever that may be, and we're just here to have a conversation about it, just to see where that conversation goes and talk about the good and the bad and likes and dislikes. But at the end of the day, we all agree that we like this thing called Star Trek. And then the other thing that we always say is that, very often Rod is there when we have a guest interview, and Rod will say, look, this is your time to shine. You should feel comfortable saying whatever you want to say. And if it makes you feel more comfortable, I'll leave the room. I'll go another room and I'll hear it all later. But if people in your audience and if people in my audience have not yet watched Trek Nation, which is a documentary that Rod made about his father, right. That played a part in creating Mission Log, in the respect that Trek Nation was about trying to figure out Gene Roddenberry, the man. What was he like? What did he really stand for? And, because he passed away when he was a young man. They really didn't necessarily have the relationship that either of them would have liked to have had. And Mission Log then became an outlet for Rod to say, well, now that we've talked about Gene, let's talk about the show. Let's talk about the body of work. And what does that mean when we try to apply it to a Roddenberry philosophy or a Roddenberry vision of humanity and, through the eyes of entertainment. And to do that and to do it respectfully and to do it right, we had to take the good and the bad. And Rod told me from the beginning, there are people who we will bring in who will put Gene Roddenberry on a pedestal, and you will not be able to get them to say one bad word about Gene. And then there are other people that you'll bring in who will say nothing but horrible things about Gene. And the truth is somewhere in between. The truth has got to be, no man is a saint, 100% perfect, and no man is 100% horrible. He's somebody who was trying to do the best job that he could, given very complex, very difficult circumstances, about a project that he cared very deeply about. Um, and given the hundreds, the thousands of people that he would have to encounter and interact with in order to make that dream come alive, um, you're bound to have interactions that don't go maybe as well as you would like them to go. I will say it's funny though. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a convention for the 50th anniversary of The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and I met two people there who need. That's the hat right there. Yeah,
very good.
I knew two people, or I met two people there who had worked with Gene Roddenberry. One was Joe Sargent, who directed the Corbomite maneuver for the original series, and the other. Yes, yeah. And I told Joe, I said, look, I do this little show about Star Trek, and we still hold up the Corbomite maneuver as one of the definitive episodes of Star Trek. And then I met George Lair, who was a producer on The Lieutenant, which was Gene Roddenberry's show before Star Trek. And both of them said the same thing. They both said, oh, I had amazing collaborative, creative relationships with Gene Roddenberry. He was fantastic, and please give my love to the family. And they're just full of praise. And at the end of the night, I said, you know what, to George Lair, I said, you're the second person who has said that about Gene Roddenberry to me. And I met both of them at this convention, you know, because I've met a lot of people who will share the stories full of praise, but they'll temper it with stories of saying, well, you know, he could be difficult. But even George Lair, he said, look, Gene was a straight shooter, and he didn't rub everybody the right way. But George Lair was a writer, Gene Roddenberry was a writer, and he said, I respected him for that, and I respected where he was coming from. So whatever he wanted, I was there to try to make that happen. And if he needed to be short about something and shoot down an idea, or, you know, maybe burn a bridge somewhere in between to make ultimately the thing happen that needed to happen, he would do it. But he said he always came away from it with respect for Gene.
Well, I just wanted to publicly acknowledge both you and Ken, for the way you handled that interview. I certainly appreciated it, and I felt like you allowed me to draw my own conclusions.
Well, thank you, and I hope that we have David Gerrold back because he worked on the first season of The Next Generation, and that was a very, very different environment from the original series. So we want him back. He might have a few more choice words to share about that experience too.
Yes, and given the analysis of the first 10 or so episodes into The Next Gen, and particularly the comments you've gotten from many of the fans, I think if anyone listens, they'll certainly understand that.
It's been a little bit of a challenge. It's been interesting, you know. I don't know that TV shows today would necessarily be given the wide berth that Next Gen was given to sort of find its way. A lot of shows now, they come on, and if they're not a hit in 3 episodes, and they're gone.
Yep.
You know?
Well, John, we're at the end of our time. I really appreciate you coming on board for an interview again. The Mission Log podcasts are at www.missionlog.com. They're also on iTunes, which I download and listen to. There's one every week. It's a fabulous site. The discovered documents are a resource and treasure that most of us who don't live in Los Angeles would never have access to. So thanks a lot for that work.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to come back and talk to you. And just one quick thing is missionlogpodcast.com, and that's where we have the discovered documents. And we love to hear back from people, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. So, yeah, check out the website, listen to the show, and this is an ongoing discussion that we're having. So we love to hear back from people.
Well, I look forward to our next visit. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Tom.